They said it was a terrible decision. After losing her husband, she spent her last savings on a dry vineyard everyone else had abandoned. No water, no crops, no future at least. That's what people believed. But one day, her young son discovered something hidden beneath that dry vineyard, something buried for years, waiting for the right moment to be found. What they uncovered wasn't just a secret beneath the soil. It was a second chance that would change their lives forever. Before we begin, subscribe for more powerful stories and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. They say grief makes people do strange things. In Sarah Caldwell's case, it made her buy land no one else wanted. After her husband died suddenly, Sarah didn't cry in public. She didn't collapse. She just grew quiet. The kind of quiet that scares people more than screaming ever could. With the insurance money, every last dollar of it, she bought 5 acres of a dry, abandoned vineyard on the edge of a forgotten valley in Northern California. The realtor tried to stop her. The soil's dead, he said. No water, no production for years. Sarah only nodded. She moved there with her son, Evan, who was just 9 years old. A thin boy with observant eyes and a habit of listening more than speaking. Their house wasn't really a house, just a crooked wooden shack that smelled of dust and old regrets. At night, the wind slid through the dead vines and howled like something mourning. Evan asked the question every child would ask. "Mom, why here?" Sarah took a long time before answering. Then she said softly, "Because sometimes the only way to survive loss is to plant yourself somewhere new, even if everyone else thinks nothing can grow there." That night, as mother and son sat in the dark eating bread with no butter, neither of them knew the truth yet. This land wasn't empty. It was waiting. The first week nearly broke them. Sarah learned quickly that grief doesn't disappear when you change addresses. It just follows you quietly, like dust on your shoes. The vineyard looked worse in daylight. Rows of twisted vines stretched across the land like old bones pushing through dry skin. The soil cracked beneath her boots when she knelt and touched it. It crumbled into powder. No birds, no insects, no sound except the wind. The shack offered little comfort. The roof leaked in 2 places. The water pump coughed out nothing but air. At night, Sarah lay awake listening to Evan's breathing, counting it like a prayer. Every calculation ran through her mind. How long the food would last, how far town was, how many mistakes she could afford before they ran out of chances. Evan tried to be brave. Children always do. He followed her between the rows, stepping where she stepped, asking fewer questions than a 9-year-old should. When Sarah's hands shook as she poured the last of the drinking water into 2 chipped cups, Evan pushed his back toward her. "You drink more, Mom," he said. "I'm bigger," she replied. "I don't mind being thirsty," he said. And she had to turn away so he wouldn't see her face. On the 5th day, the heat became unbearable. The sun hung over the vineyard like something personal, pressing down, testing them. Sarah sent Evan inside the shack to rest while she tried the pump again, gripping the rusted handle until her palms burned. Nothing. She sank to the ground beside it, elbows on her knees, head bowed. For the first time since her husband's funeral, she whispered the words she'd been holding back. "I don't know if I can do this." That was when she heard Evan scream. It wasn't a long scream, just one sharp sound, pure fear that sliced through the air. Sarah was on her feet before her mind caught up, running, heart pounding so hard it hurt. She found him between the rows, standing frozen, eyes locked on the ground. "Mom," he whispered. "I fell, but not all the way." The earth beneath one of the vines had collapsed into a narrow opening, not a hole exactly. more like a mouth that had been quietly waiting to open. Sarah dropped to her knees, pulling Evan back by the shoulders. "Are you hurt?" "No," he said. "But I heard something." They stood still. At first, Sarah thought it was the wind again. Then she heard it too, a sound so soft it almost wasn't there. Water. Not dripping, not pooling, flowing. Sarah's breath caught. Slowly. Carefully. She leaned forward and brushed away loose dirt with her hands. The opening widened just enough to reveal darkness below and cool air rising up to meet them. "I think—" Evan swallowed. "I think it's coming from under the ground." They didn't go down right away. Sarah wasn't reckless. She marked the spot, led Evan back to the shack, and spent the next hour pacing, arguing with herself. But desperation has a way of sharpening courage. By late afternoon, with a rope fashioned from old twine and a flashlight that barely worked, they returned. Sarah went first. The drop was short, barely 6 feet, but when her boots touched solid ground, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Coolness. The air below was damp, alive. She shined the light along the tunnel wall and froze. Someone had been there before. The walls weren't natural. They were shaped, reinforced, and carved into the stone, faint but unmistakable, were markings, measurements, arrows, symbols Sarah didn't understand yet. Evan slid down after her, eyes wide. "Mom," he said softly. "Look." The flashlight beam followed his finger to a narrow channel running along the floor. Clear water moved through it, steady and quiet, disappearing into the darkness beyond. Sarah dropped to her knees and pressed her hand into it. "Cold, clean, real." She laughed, once sharp and broken, and then she cried, not quietly, not politely. She cried like someone who had been holding her breath for too long and finally remembered how to breathe. "There's water," she whispered. "Evan, there's water." They sat there for a long time, mother and son, feet soaked, backs against stone, listening to the sound that had just changed everything. When Sarah finally stood, wiping her face, something on the wall caught her eye. Letters. Faint but deliberate, carved by a careful hand. "So, years ago." Sarah stared at them, her chest tightening. "This wasn't an accident," she said slowly. "Someone planned this." Evan tilted his head. "Who?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She thought of the old land records she'd skimmed, the Vineyard's strange price, the way the realtor had avoided her eyes. She thought of how grief had pushed her here, not away from life, but straight into its hardest soil. "I don't know yet," she said, "but whoever did this, they didn't give up on this land." They climbed back out as the sun dipped low. The vineyard bathed in amber light. The vines still looked dead. The soil still cracked. But Sarah saw it differently now. That night, she pulled out the old notebook she'd found tucked behind a loose board in the shack weeks earlier, something she'd ignored because she hadn't had the energy to be curious. Now, by candlelight, she opened it. The first page wasn't a diary. It was a plan. And as Evan leaned against her shoulder, listening to the pages turn, Sarah understood the truth. She hadn't bought a grave. She had inherited a map. Sarah didn't sleep that night. The candle burned low on the small table, its flame trembling every time the wind slipped through the cracks in the shack. Evan slept beside her, curled on the thin mattress, one hand still clutching her sleeve like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. Sarah sat upright, the old notebook open in her lap. Page after page, it unfolded like a voice that had been waiting patiently to be heard. Diagrams of root systems, Hand-drawn maps of the vineyard, depth measurements, water flow angles. This wasn't the work of a desperate landowner guessing in the dark. This was precision, care, years of thought pressed into ink and paper. Sarah ran her fingers along the margin notes, her lips moving silently as she read. Water must never touch the roots at midday. Dormant vines are not dead. They are conserving life. Patience is not waiting. It is preparing while nothing appears to happen. Her throat tightened. Whoever wrote this had believed in the vineyard long after everyone else had walked away. At the back of the notebook, the handwriting changed. Softer, less technical. If you're reading this, it means you didn't leave. That tells me everything I need to know about you. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth. She closed the notebook slowly, as if afraid the words might vanish if she moved too fast. Morning came quietly. The vineyard looked the same as it had the day before, gray, lifeless, stubborn. But Sarah saw beneath it now. She saw water moving in darkness, roots gripping soil deeper than sight. After breakfast, 2 slices of bread split carefully. Evan followed her back to the opening in the ground. "Can I help today?" he asked. Sarah hesitated. Then she nodded. "Yes. But we do it slow. Together." They widened the entrance carefully, reinforcing it with scrap wood from the shack. Sarah marked the channel's direction, tracing it with a stick, realizing it ran parallel to the rows of vines. "This water wasn't meant for one spot," she murmured. "It was meant for everything." For 3 days, they worked quietly. Sarah forgot the calendar, forgot the ache in her shoulders, even forgot, sometimes, the sharp edge of loss that had followed her since the funeral. Purpose has a way of pushing pain into the background, not erasing it, but making it survivable. On the 4th day, something went wrong. Evan was carrying a small bucket back from the tunnel when his foot slipped on loose gravel. He fell hard, the bucket rolling away, water soaking into the dirt uselessly. He didn't cry right away. That was what scared Sarah. She ran to him, dropping to her knees. "Evan, are you hurt?" "I'm okay," he said too quickly. Then his voice broke. "I'm sorry. I wasted it." Sarah pulled him into her arms. "No," she said firmly. "Nothing is wasted, especially not effort." He buried his face in her shoulder. "I just want it to work," he whispered. "I want it to work for you." Sarah closed her eyes. That was when she realized something terrifying and beautiful at the same time. This vineyard wasn't just about survival anymore. It had become Evan's way of trying to save her. That night, the unexpected happened. A truck pulled up outside the shack. Sarah froze, her heart jumping into her throat. No one came this far out unless they meant to. She stepped outside, Evan close behind her, and squinted into the headlights. An older woman stepped out slowly, leaning on a cane. Her hair was silver, pulled back neatly, her eyes sharp and observant despite the years etched around them. "I was wondering when someone would finally come back," the woman said. Sarah straightened. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" The woman smiled faintly. "No. But I knew this land better than most." She glanced at the rows, at the disturbed soil near the vines, at the faint tracks of work that hadn't been there before. "You found it," she said. "Didn't you?" Sarah didn't answer. She didn't have to. The woman nodded. Satisfied. "Name's Margaret Avery," she said. "I helped design that irrigation system 20 years ago." Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "You built it." "Not alone," Margaret replied. "I worked with a woman who believed this vineyard deserved another chance. Smarter than me. More stubborn, too." She paused, studying Sarah's face. She said one day, someone would come who needed this land as much as it needed them, and if they stayed long enough to hear the water, then it was theirs. Evan stepped forward, eyes wide. She wrote in a notebook. He blurted out, "We found it. Margaret's expression softened. "So she kept her promise," she said quietly. Sarah's voice trembled. "Who was she?" Margaret took a breath. Someone who knew loss, someone who knew soil, and someone who knew that real legacies aren't left in money, but in instructions. She looked at the vineyard one last time before turning back toward her truck. "If you're willing to work," Margaret said, "I can help you read the rest of it." Sarah didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, "please." As the truck disappeared down the dirt road, Evan looked up at his mother. "Mom," he said softly, "it's like the land remembers." Sarah smiled through the ache in her chest. "Yes," she replied, "and it's starting to talk back." Margaret Avery came every morning after that, always just after sunrise, always in the same old truck. She never knocked, just waited at the edge of the vineyard, leaning on her cane, watching, not judging, observing. Sarah noticed everything about her, the way her eyes followed the slope of the land instead of the vines themselves, the way she listened more than she spoke, and most of all, the way she never once said the words Sarah secretly feared. "This won't work." Instead, Margaret asked questions. "How deep did you dig yesterday? Which rows dry first? What time does the sun leave this side of the hill?" At first, Sarah answered hesitantly, like a student afraid of being wrong. But Margaret never corrected her outright. She only nodded, sometimes smiled, sometimes said, "Good. That means you're paying attention." Evan followed them everywhere. He carried tools too heavy for his arms. He memorized the shapes in the notebook faster than Sarah could. When Margaret explained root dormancy, Evan listened like it was a secret meant just for him. One afternoon, after hours of digging and redirecting water, Sarah finally asked the question that had been burning inside her. "Why did everyone leave?" she said, wiping dirt from her hands. "If this place had water, why did it fail?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She walked to one of the oldest vines and knelt with effort, brushing away soil at its base. "Because people confuse silence with death," she said at last. "These vines stopped producing, no fruit, no reward. So they were declared useless." She looked up at Sarah. But underground, they were busy surviving. That night, Sarah lay awake again, but this time, not from fear. Her mind replayed the past months, the move, the doubt, the quiet moments when she'd almost packed up and left. How close she'd been to calling the vineyard a mistake. She realized something that unsettled her. She hadn't really believed in the land. Not fully. She had believed in endurance, in getting through, but belief, the kind that changes how you act, was something else entirely. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She stopped treating the vineyard like a gamble and started treating it like a responsibility. She reorganized the days, mornings for water work, afternoons for soil and reading, evenings for notes. She kept a journal beside the old notebook, writing what worked, what didn't, and what scared her. Evan noticed the change immediately. "You're different," he said one evening as they sat on the shack steps, watching the sky darken. "How so?" she asked. "You don't look like you're waiting for it to fail anymore." Sarah smiled faintly. "I think I finally stopped asking if we should be here." The vineyard answered slowly. Not with green, not with miracles, but with resistance. 1 week later, a section of redirected water collapsed overnight, flooding 3 rows and washing soil away. Sarah stared at the damage in silence, her chest tightening. Margaret studied it, then handed Sarah a shovel. "Soil teaches faster when it pushes back," she said. Another week, insects appeared, tiny, relentless. Evan panicked, convinced they'd ruin everything. Margaret shrugged. "Life attracts life," she said. "Now you have something worth protecting." Sarah felt her confidence waver daily. There were moments quiet, Dangerous moments when she wondered if belief was just another word for stubbornness, if hope was simply denial dressed up nicely. One afternoon, after Evan had gone inside, Sarah finally broke. "I'm scared," she admitted to Margaret, her voice barely steady. "What if I'm wrong? What if I dragged my son into this because I couldn't face standing still?" Margaret rested both hands on her cane. "Let me ask you something," she said. "Before this vineyard, what were you teaching him?" Sarah frowned. Teaching him? Yes, without meaning to. Sarah thought of the funeral, the boxes, the quiet nights when she stared at walls instead of futures. "I was teaching him how to survive loss," she said slowly. Margaret nodded. "And now?" Sarah looked out at the rows, at Evan's small footprints in the dirt, at the water channel catching light. "Now I'm teaching him how to build something anyway." Margaret smiled. "Then even if the vines fail," she said, "this will not have been a mistake." That night, the temperature dropped unexpectedly. Sarah woke before dawn to a sharp cold and rushed outside. Frost clung to the ground, thin and dangerous. She stood there, heart racing, convinced it was over, that all their careful work had come too late. Evan joined her, shivering in his jacket. "Is it bad?" he asked. Sarah knelt beside one vine, brushing away frost with trembling fingers. She held her breath. Beneath the gray bark, she saw it. Not green, but swollen. A subtle change, almost invisible, a promise only someone who had been watching closely would notice. Margaret arrived an hour later, took one look, and nodded once. "They're waking up," she said. Sarah's knees gave out. She sat in the dirt, laughing and crying at the same time. Evan hugged her from behind. "So it's real," he whispered. Sarah reached for his hand. "It always was," she said. "We just weren't ready to see it." As the sun climbed higher, melting the frost, Sarah felt something shift inside her. She no longer saw the vineyard as a test of luck or courage. She saw it as a conversation. And for the first time, she believed deeply, dangerously, that if she listened closely enough, the land would keep answering. The first opportunity didn't arrive with fanfare. It came quietly, the way most real chances do, wearing the face of something small and almost forgettable. It started with weeds, not the choking kind that steal life, but the stubborn ones that refused to die. Between the rows of dormant vines, tiny patches of green had survived the heat, the frost, the neglect. Margaret Avery noticed them before anyone else. "Do you smell that?" she asked one morning. Sarah bent down and brushed the leaves between her fingers. A sharp, clean scent rose into the air. "Lavender," she said, surprised. Margaret nodded. "Wild lavender. Grows where the soil still remembers how to hold on." Evan crouched beside them, curious. "Can we use it?" Margaret smiled. "That depends. Do you want food, or do you want money?" Sarah laughed softly. It was the first time in weeks. They harvested at dawn, before the sun burned the oils away. Evan cut carefully, as if each stem mattered. Sarah tied the bundles with twine salvaged from the shack. By mid-morning, their hands smelled like calm and clean air instead of dust and fear. Margaret showed them how to hang the bundles upside down in the shade. "Too much moisture, and it rots," she warned. "Too much sun, and it loses its strength. Balance matters." For the next 5 days, the shack changed. The scent of lavender filled the air, pushing out the old smell of damp wood and resignation. At night, Sarah noticed Evan sleeping deeper, his breathing slower, like his body had finally decided it was safe to rest. While they waited for the lavender to dry, Margaret taught them something else. How to make something with your hands. She brought scraps of fabric, A needle. Thread. Evan struggled at first, poking his fingers, frustrated. Sarah watched him, heart tight, until he took a breath and tried again. "I'll get it," he muttered. "I always do." On the 5th day, disaster struck. Moths! They fluttered wildly inside the shack, drawn to the scent. By the time Sarah noticed, several bundles were ruined petals eaten, stems bare. Evan's face crumpled. "We lost them," he whispered. Sarah felt the familiar surge of panic rise in her chest. The voice that said, "Here it is. This is where it falls apart." Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't sigh. She reached into her bag and pulled out dried red peppers. "Hanging these will drive them away," she said. "The land always tests you once before it rewards you." They started over. This time, they succeeded. By Saturday, they had 30 small sachets, hand-sewn and uneven, but beautiful in their own way. Evan drew the labels himself, simple purple flowers, and 2 words written carefully. Caldwell Lavender. Sunday morning. Sarah hesitated. "Do you really think people will buy these?" she asked. Margaret met her eyes. "They're not buying lavender," she said. "They're buying care." The church fair filled the town square with voices and music. Sarah and Evan set up a small table in the corner, their sachets lined up neatly. A handwritten sign read $15 each. Evan stood close to Sarah, his hand wrapped around hers. The first customer was a woman with tired eyes. She picked up a sachet, inhaled, and closed her eyes. "This smells like my grandmother's house," she said. "I'll take 2. Sarah's hand shook as she took the money. Then another sale, and another. A man bought one for his truck. A young mother bought 3 for her children's drawers. The table slowly emptied. By afternoon, they were sold out. Sarah counted the bills 3 times. $450. Evan stared at the stack like it might disappear. "Mom," he whispered. "We did this." Sarah hugged him, her chin resting on his hair. "No," she said softly. "We started something." They walked home with groceries for the first time that didn't require calculation. Bread, beans, eggs, even fruit. Evan carried the bags proudly, his steps lighter. That night, as they ate with full plates, Sarah felt something new settle into her bones. Not relief. Direction. She set aside part of the money in a tin and placed it beneath a loose floorboard. "For the vineyard," she told Evan. He nodded seriously. "For the roots." Outside, the lavender swayed gently in the evening breeze. The vines still looked gray, still silent, but Sarah knew better now. Opportunity hadn't come to save them. It had come to ask a question. What will you build with what you've been given? And for the first time since loss had rearranged her life, Sarah felt ready to answer. Growth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with applause or certainty. Most of the time, it shows up disguised as routine early mornings, sore muscles, quiet decisions made when no one is watching. That was how it happened for Sarah and Evan. The days settled into a rhythm. Wake before sunrise, check the water channels, read a few pages from the notebook, work the soil, adjust, observe, write things down, try again tomorrow. Sarah stopped counting days and started counting changes instead. Her hands hardened first. The skin cracked and healed and cracked again until it no longer surprised her. Her body grew stronger in ways she hadn't expected, not just endurance, but confidence. She stopped flinching when things went wrong, stopped apologizing to the land as if it were judging her. Evan changed too. The boy who once hovered at her side now moved with purpose. He remembered which rows needed less water. He corrected Sarah gently when she forgot a measurement. At night, He studied the diagrams in the notebook like secrets meant just for him. You know, Margaret said one afternoon, watching him work, most adults never learn how to really look. Evan didn't look up. I do, he said simply. The land tells you things. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Winter passed slowly. The vineyard remained mostly gray, stubbornly quiet. Neighbors drove by occasionally, slowing their cars just enough to stare. Sarah heard the unspoken question in their silence. Why hasn't she given up yet? There were moments she wanted to. One night, after Evan had gone to bed, Sarah sat alone in the shack, staring at the notebook. Her husband's face floated into her mind, not as he'd been at the end, but laughing, alive, certain of things she now doubted. I wish you were here, she whispered. I don't know if I'm doing this right. The land, as always, didn't answer immediately. Spring arrived without ceremony. No explosion of green, no sudden miracle. Just one morning, Evan stopped walking. Mom, he said quietly. Sarah followed his gaze. A single vine, one she would have sworn was dead, had pushed out something new. Not much, just a thin curl of green, fragile and trembling in the breeze. Sarah knelt slowly, afraid her excitement might scare it away. It's real, Evan whispered. She touched it with 2 fingers, barely breathing. Yes, she said. It's real. That was enough. The next weeks brought more signs. Not many, but enough to confirm what Margaret had said from the beginning. The vines weren't dead. They had been waiting. Work intensified. Sarah learned pruning, the hardest lesson of all, cutting away growth to strengthen what remained. It felt wrong at first, almost cruel. Growth requires loss, Margaret said, even when it hurts. Sarah understood that better than she wanted to. Evan took pride in hauling water from the channel, trip after trip, refusing help even when his arms shook. I can do it, he insisted. The roots need me. By the time summer arrived, nearly a quarter of the vineyard showed signs of life. It wasn't success yet, but it was undeniable. People noticed. A man from town stopped by one afternoon, leaning against his truck. Heard you're bringing this place back, he said, skeptical but curious. Sarah wiped her hands and met his eyes. We're trying. He nodded slowly. Let me know if you need help with fencing. The offers came quietly. Advice? Old tools. An extra pair of hands one weekend. Sarah learned something then. Pride isolates. Purpose invites. Evan started school that fall. The first morning, he stood at the edge of the dirt road with his backpack too big for his shoulders, lavender sachet tucked inside like a talisman. Will you be okay? He asked her. Sarah smiled. I'll be right where you left me. And she worked while he was gone. Read, planned, made mistakes and fixed them. When Evan came home, dusty and full of stories, she listened like it mattered because it did. By the second year, the lavender sales had stabilized. The vineyard showed real progress, not abundance but promise. Evan grew taller. His voice deepened slightly. He argued with Sarah now, respectfully but firmly, backed by facts and diagrams. You're watering too late, he told her one evening. The notebook says, early only. Sarah laughed, exhausted and proud. Then I guess I'd better listen. Margaret watched it all with quiet satisfaction. You've stopped surviving. She told Sarah one day, you're leading. Sarah looked at her son, bent over a vine, focused and steady. No, she said softly. We are. By the third spring, green stretched across the vineyard in patches large enough to change the way the land looked from the road. People no longer slowed to stare. They stopped to ask questions. Sarah Caldwell was no longer the grieving woman who bought dead land. She was the woman who stayed. and Evan, once just a quiet boy trying not to be a burden, had become something else entirely. Not a child being carried forward by hope, but a partner building it root by root. The first real harvest didn't happen all at once. It came the way everything else on that land had come, quietly, patiently, almost shyly. One morning, Sarah walked the rows and realized the vineyard no longer looked like something abandoned. Green had begun to stitch the earth back together. The vines stood straighter. The air smelled different, fuller. Evan noticed it too. "They look awake," he said, running his hand along a cluster of leaves. Sarah smiled. "They are. By late summer, small clusters appeared. Not many. Not impressive to anyone who measured success by abundance. But to Sarah, they were proof of something far greater than profit. They were proof that staying had mattered. Margaret came one afternoon and stood silently among the rows. She didn't touch the vines. She didn't give advice. She just watched Sarah and Evan work side by side. "You've done what most people can't," she said finally. "You didn't rush the ending." The first wine was modest. Small barrels, careful measurements. Evan followed every instruction like a ritual. Sarah double-checked everything, her hands steady now, her doubt quieter. When the time came to taste it, they gathered in the shack, no ceremony, no expectations, just 3 cups on a wooden table. Sarah lifted hers last. "For your father," she said softly. "And for everything we didn't know how to survive." They drank. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and it was theirs. Word traveled faster than Sarah expected. A local tasting event, a small regional showcase. People who'd once shaken their heads at her now asked how she'd done it. She never gave them a dramatic answer. "We listened," she said, "and we didn't leave." The invitation that changed everything arrived in a plain envelope. A regional agricultural competition. Small producers. First-time entries encouraged. Sarah hesitated. "What if it's not ready?" she asked. Evan looked at her the way he always did when he already knew the answer. "Mom, it's not about winning." She nodded. They entered. The day of the announcement. Sarah stood in a quiet hall holding Evan's hand. Judges moved from table to table, tasting, writing, nodding without expression. Sarah didn't look for approval anymore. She'd learned better. When the results were read, she didn't understand at first. Then Evan squeezed her hand so hard it hurt. They had won. Not first place, something better. Recognition for resilience, innovation rooted in sustainability, a grant, and a distribution offer small enough to be real but big enough to change their lives. Sarah cried then, not from shock, not from joy alone. From release, from the understanding that the hardest part had already passed, and it wasn't the work. It had been believing she was allowed to build something after loss. The money helped, of course it did. They repaired the shack properly, hired help during harvest, expanded carefully, never faster than the land allowed. Evan went to school with dirt still under his nails and pride in his stride. Sarah stood straighter when she spoke. But the real victory wasn't measured in dollars or barrels. It was measured in the way Evan slept at night, deep, unafraid, in the way Sarah could finally look toward the future without flinching. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the vineyard gold, Evan asked the question that had been growing inside him. "Mom," he said, "do you think this place saved us? Or we saved it?" Sarah thought for a long moment. "I think," she said slowly, "we met each other when we both needed someone to stay." Evan nodded, satisfied. Years later, people would ask Sarah for advice. How do you start over? How do you survive loss? How do you know when to keep going? She never gave them strategies. She told them a story instead. About dry land, about a child who listened, about roots that grew in darkness long before anyone could see them. And she always ended the same way. Not everything that looks dead is finished, she'd say. Some things are just waiting for someone brave enough to believe they still matter. As the vineyard whispered softly in the evening wind, Sarah Caldwell knew one thing with absolute certainty. She hadn't rebuilt her life despite loss. She had rebuilt it through it. Anyone can rebuild a life if they're willing to stay when leaving feels easier, and believe patiently when nothing looks alive yet. As the sun dipped low over the Caldwell vineyard, Sarah closed the worn notebook and watched Evan walk between the rows, checking the vines like someone who knew they mattered. That night, she opened a fresh page not to record measurements, but to write plans for the future, a vineyard that would welcome others who had been told their season was over, a place where loss didn't mean the end, just the beginning of something deeper. She understood it now. The land she once bought in grief no longer belonged only to her. It belonged to every parent trying to start over, every child growing up too fast, every person who had ever been left with dry soil and quiet doubt. The woman who arrived with nothing but faith had become someone who could offer hope, and the boy who once followed behind had learned how to lead. Because for Sarah, and for those who come after her, the vineyard was never the finish line. It was where life began again,